Forum Borealis Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, and welcome to Forum Borealis and a new program in our 6th series called Exploring Esoteric Philosophy. Today we have back our regular guest Joseph Patrick Farrell. He is the definition of a Renaissance man, commanding a large number of subjects, and today we will finally hear from him on matters which is covered by his formal education. His PhD in patristics is from Oxford University. He's a former professor and a noteworthy documents researcher with an incredible ability to perceive new angles from old expositions, delving into all sorts of primary sources. On the artistic side, he plays cembalo and composes classical music in the Baroque style of Bach. When it comes to books, he's like a German factory. So far he's written 33 in less than 20 years. You will find a biography and his full bibliography at our website with links to his own online presence, including his membership site called Giza Death Star from one of his early books. Now, today we have him on to discuss a subtle and profound matter that is permeating many of his books, but that he's rarely interviewed about, and that we may refer to as the Topological Metaphor. It attempts to decode and describe nothing less than the cosmic structure, in line with the accounts of the ancient traditions from all corners of our world. It is described in many different ways and related with different symbolism and myths, but always pointing to the same essential principles, of which numbers are probably its purest expression. You do not need much knowledge of philosophy, esotericism, symbolism, or math, etc. to grasp the discussion. All you need is an open mind and an open heart, and you will comprehend your own angle from it, like we all do. The matter is objective, but the perception of it, the grasping of it, is necessarily subjective. Bon appétit. Welcome back to the forum, Joseph.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, really looking forward to our little conversation today, because we're taking a break from our usual topics, and today you'll get to apply your original education. Because
maybe however much of it I can remember.
Whatever they manage to beat into you.
Yeah, that's right.
So today I was thinking about free philosophizing.
Okay.
Because it is a fact that, like everyone says about you, you're a very prolific writer. You write very fast. I can hardly keep up with you as a reader, actually. But you also have this, when we observe you as an author, there is this phenomenon that I mentioned, that you handle very many different subjects. And many people do this, but you handle it with depth, precision. And this too makes you stand out. And one of those approaches or aspects to your authorship that people appreciate that hasn't been, I think, enough explored in interviews is the philosophical side, because it's right up there with people who only write about these things. And by the way, I have to confess that, and this is just a personal choice, has nothing to do with religion or morals or anything, but I'm a very straight-edge guy. I like keeping myself healthy and clear in mind, and so I very rarely become tipsy.
Right.
But yesterday I was lured out with some friends, so I'm having a little groggy head today. So it's quite a challenge for me to have this conversation with you, but I'll try. I was thinking to explore some of the philosophical stratas that is lurking in many of your books, which will help people, I think, appreciate many of your topics if they get this deeper thing. And so let's just start with the so-called topological metaphor.
Okay.
I've heard you beautifully explain this to George Ann, and she was no nonsense. She forced you to explain it as simply as possible. And I've always been an adherent to the saying that if you can't explain something simply, you have not really, really understood it in its core. I have subscribed to both the notions that you should have as simple language as possible, not unnecessarily to cloak it with exotic terms, but also that you should have as precise language as possible.
You're right.
Because when we get to these more etherical topics, to the more abstract thinking, you can't detach language from realization. Those two things, as you know, are deeply integrated. So a precise but simple language is the ultimate ideal. So let's try then. The topological metaphor, how would you put it to us?
Well, unfortunately, the topological metaphor is an abstraction of an abstraction. There is no way to put it simply. People grapple with it, but let's approach it historically as to why I came up with this idea. If you look at medieval debates, for example, of God and space, you'll find something very peculiar, something very, very interesting. And this goes all the way back into the classical philosophers, Plato, the Neoplatonists, and so on.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm a bit educated there, so yeah.
Well, it even goes into systems of Eastern religion, Taoism, Hinduism, and so on. This metaphor is quite literally a metaphor. You find it everywhere you turn once you are able to train your eyes to look for it. But perhaps the easiest way for a Western audience is to approach it through what begins to happen in the Middle Ages, when this is first starting to be realized. And by realized, I mean consciously looked at rather than something so obvious it's taken for granted.
Or carried by underground groups like Templars.
Or carried by underground groups, right, exactly. Which I think happened in the West. I think it was carried for a very long time by underground groups. But if you look at the medieval debates about God, about space, you'll discover the very interesting thing that the language being used, the technical language being used, is often the very same. Let's give an example. When you look at medieval scholastic philosophy, for example, God will be described as ubiquitous or omnipresent. And if you turn to the same philosophers, oftentimes, you'll see them using the same language of space. Can you think of anywhere where space is not? Okay, so in other words, the conception itself is omnipresent. It's ubiquitous. So they begin to notice that the language for God and the language for space is oftentimes the very same. Let's give another example. God is oftentimes described as incorporeal or immaterial. Well, space, when you stop and think about it, is in those terms incorporeal or immaterial. And then the real breakout for this concept is that when you start looking at the descriptions of the idea of creation ex nihilo, creation literally out of nothing, all right? It's when you look at that term nothing or no thing that you really begin to see this metaphor break out in a major way. Because if you look at the medieval scholastics as they're talking about God, they will always caution and say that when we're talking about God, we're using analogy. All right. Yeah. And that ultimately God is a non-intelligible entity. That is to say that he's a no thing. There's no category of thought or conception that totally encompasses. So the same thing, they notice, also begins to happen with space. It's a no thing. And before creation, what do you have? Well, you have a no thing. And let's bring it forward a little bit more. Let's bring it more into the modern age with modern physics and the idea of a Big Bang. Well, what's there before the Big Bang? Well, nothing, no thing. And this is where it really begins to break out, because...
Hang on, you're saying that in the medieval ages is when it's starting to become a conscious topic.
Right.
Do you see this in relation to the concept of zero being reintroduced to Europe about the same time? I'm thinking of this famous, in the Renaissance at least, this famous
Yes.
Italian, because with the concept of zero and depth or negative values,
Right.
they open up for a practical understanding of this
Oh, yes.
no thing. So
Yeah.
is there a correlation there?
Oh, yes, I think so, absolutely. But the idea of a zero is not even itself quite close enough to this no thing. Mathematics has a wonderful symbol, which I've used to express this metaphor, and that's called the empty hyperset. In other words, it's a set containing no members but all functions. Okay? That's about the simplest way to put it. But when you look at it this way, when you look at physics, natural philosophy, as they called it back then, could not talk about nothing. In other words, you had to have something observable in order to describe motion in space.
Yeah, what about a vacuum?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. The vacuum, what's the vacuum? Well, it's another nothing. It's another no thing that differentiates itself. And that's the key word here. Because when you go back to ancient systems, you have, of course, within Christianity and Judaism, the idea of creation ex nihilo. You go back to ancient Egypt, you get very much the same idea of an all-pervasive no thing, which undergoes differentiation. And out of that process of differentiation, everything is created. So in other words, this idea of a creation out of no thing or nothing isn't really unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's pretty much everywhere if you know how to look for it. But now this is a key thing here, because let's imagine that we have an infinitely extended sameness. With that infinitely extended sameness, you have a nothing. You can't latch on to anything, all right? But let's say now, just imagine that you draw a line or a plane, that you cleave it, that you cut it, that you slice it, or to use the mathematical term, that you differentiate it. Immediately, when you've done this, you've created three nothings. Not two, three, because you've got one region of nothing that's distinct from the other region of nothing, and then you've got the common surface between the two, which is still a nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but now what's very interesting is you've added information to this system, and so every time you perform this differentiation, you can do it any number of times. What is interesting is if you symbolize this process with a kind of quasi-topological or pseudo-topological mathematical notation, what you'll discover is something very odd, something uniquely interesting and to me very exciting. And that is that the initial empty hyperset that you are performing this differentiation upon remains in every single formal description of every single derivative that you can deduce or derive from that
like
process.
Holographic principle.
Yes, exactly. It's always there, but the surrounding information content will vary. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means very basically that you've symbolized the process of analogy. Because what's analogy? Analogy is the way we human beings learn. We learn from a familiar context by noticing parallel concepts, structures, forms, so on and so forth, from one context to another context. So you've set up also a process of what mathematicians call mapping, and you're noticing the continuities and discontinuities between topological regions, or we could also say academic disciplines. What does the rhetorical tropy of let's say, a reversal look like in music? Is there such a thing in music? Well, yeah, there is. Is there such a thing in literature? Well, yeah, there is. What you're setting up, in other words, is you're setting up the process of analogy itself.
Yeah.
And what the metaphor is really telling you then is that it is possible that reality itself, that the underlying medium of the physical world that we think is all that's there, is ultimately analogical in nature, and therefore an operation of intelligence, that you can look at this, so to speak, as kind of a topological approach to intelligent design, with a key codicil that this is also kind of a self-organizing process. So it has huge implications for philosophical metaphysics, because you can't pigeonhole this process into, let's say, pantheism or monotheism or panentheism or polytheism, or any of the isms that classical philosophical metaphysics deals with, because it looks like and has features of all of them. It's kind of an acid drip on all of these things. Now, the other interesting thing about this is once you see this metaphor unfolding, then you can start to look at philosophical texts themselves, or for that matter, Hermetic texts or mythological texts and so on, and see behind the language to the structure of the metaphor that's present in it.
Exactly.
And once you've taken that step, once you realize that this is all expressible as a symbolic language, it allows you to go merrily dancing and skipping from one context to another. And to do so, once you understand the process and have learned the little simple rules of how it works, it enables you to do so deftly. In other words, your analogies don't have the quality of being inept, but they have the quality of being quite apt once you see how the process works. So, I've attempted to model this in various books, but I tell people that every book that I have written, the reason why I tell people that every book dovetails intentionally into every other book is because that's quite true, because I'm using this process to write them.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Really? So this is a template for how you're writing them?
Yes, this is a template for exactly how I'm writing the books, why I'm writing them in a certain sequence, why I make deliberate reference from one to the other that may seem like the contexts are totally unrelated. But no, they are very deliberately laid out according to what I've tried to learn about this metaphor over many, many years of looking at it.
I'll call it a natural system.
Yeah, it's very natural.
You're imitating nature.
You're imitating nature. You're imitating the way the human mind works. Both, and I should caution people, this is true both of an individual observer and of group observers, although it's very interesting when you look at the group process when it's doing this type of thing. It arrives at analogies in the derivative system that are of a much higher order than an individual. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's very simple.
We lift each other. Is a resonance going on?
Yeah. It's a sort of resonance. A resonance, again, is a kind of analogy because you've got a fundamental, let's say, a certain structure or form that appears in one context. And then let's say you're an individual that's particularly adept at looking at these kinds of things, and then you notice the same structure in a very different sort of context, and then then there's a third appearance of it over here in this third context. Well, what happens in the process of analogy, if you look at it very carefully, if you start at one context and map to another context, or notice the same thing in another context, what happens is very interesting. You lose a certain amount of meaning from the context you're moving from, but you're gaining a certain amount of meaning from the context that you're going to. All right?
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. It's an obvious sort of process. Think of translating a book from one language to another. Well, you're going to lose a certain amount of meaning that's present in the original language, but you're also, what most people don't get, is they're going to pick up a certain amount of meaning from the language they're going into.
I've experienced this.
Yeah.
Because I've translated a lot of stuff.
Sure, yeah.
And I've translated stuff which is supposed to convey deeper stratas. And it's exactly when it comes to these things that you have a whole new universe. If you adapt in the translation, you can actually reconnect with stuff that wasn't in the original text, but was a parallel in that culture, in that language.
Right, exactly. This is something that anybody that's worked on translations will know quite well. Well, what I'm saying and suggesting is that this is true of all movements between any context and another context. You lose a certain amount of meaning, you gain a certain amount of meaning.
Not just languages, but any expression, any approach.
Exactly. Now, let's say this individual has done this through X number of contexts. Well, the interesting thing is at the end of the process, his analogy is going to look nothing like what he started with. Okay, it's going to look very different because he's tracked it linearly through several different contexts. Now, let's take a group of several people, each of them looking at maybe one or two contexts and then pooling their observations. Now, in doing so, they may get to the same place that the individual does at the end of the process, but as a result of the group doing it, it's going to be a higher order derivative. In other words, in the mathematical expression of it, it's going to be a stronger analogy, let's put it that way, than an individual looking at it. So there's actually a group effect here, what I've said many times is a kind of a group multiplier effect that occurs. So it's not true in all cases, but that's just kind of a simplistic illustration of this. But the fact remains that if you're starting from this initial no thing, that in each and every stage of the process, that initial no thing remains as part of the formal description of the process. And when you look at it very carefully, what distinguishes, I'll kind of tease the listeners here, because what distinguishes, in my thinking, analogical from logical deduction from induction is simply the way that this is notated symbolically. In other words, each of those three very different types of human reasoning processes has basically the same formal structure as part of its description. What is different in each case is where that original null context or empty hyperset actually appears in the notation. So what it also is suggesting is that there is an ultimate, if you will, similarity of form between supposedly these three supposedly discrete types of thought.
These three being syllogical and inductive and deductive, right?
Being deductive, inductive, and analogical.
Analogical.
Analogical simply means a direct mapping from a specific context to another context.
Yeah, like a metaphor. Yeah.
Like a metaphor, exactly. So yeah, these things, it's fascinating stuff, And
that's the most intuitive, by the way.
It is the most intuitive, yes, it is. Because there is this innate ability that I think all humans have. And this is why, I think it was good to start out with education, because good education trains the mind how to recognize these things. And there's another thing that we need to be aware of. Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, had the idea of innate grammatical competence. We're all born with the capacity to learn languages because ultimately all languages have very, very similar elements.
Oh, I think this is scientifically confirmed now, by the way.
Yeah, it is. It is. But what's more interesting, as far as I'm concerned, is I think using Chomsky's idea, I think we are all born with an innate analogical competence, all right? And the reason why I think that is because if you look at human beings, when we're talking with each other, for example, we'll get into a discussion where someone makes an analogy, and what immediately ensues? Well, someone will say, well, I don't agree. Your analogy doesn't hold because of such and such. In other words, we all have a sense of what an inept analogy is, a clumsy one. Yeah. But we all, by the same token, have a sense of what constitutes a good analogy. Now, the real trick is, can that be formally specified? Can we turn the light of reason to look at that question more closely and see if there is something that distinguishes an apt from
like a pattern?
Yeah,
a method.
Yeah, a method, exactly. So again, this metaphor idea, I think, kind of hints at that possibility as well. So it's a very long way to go around Harvey's barn, but it's a very powerful tool. Yeah. Once you've perceived what it is, the difficulty most people have is being able to clear away the informal technical jargon and looking at the symbolism itself and seeing that it's really symbolizing an underlying structure behind a lot of these things. I think previously we've talked in some of your interviews about the fact that I think that three very famous mathematicians were getting very close to recognizing this. Have we talked about Newton and Descartes and Leibniz in this respect?
I've heard you talk with Georgiana about it, though. So yeah.
Well, let me read you some quotations here. I want you to listen to these very, very carefully. Okay. All right, yep. Because these are the indicators. This is from a little book of mine that I and Scott DeHart wrote, called Talk Radio for the Eyes, Transhumanism and Dialogue, because we got a lot of questions from people about the transhumanism.
Yeah, I've noticed that little sly little book that has come out there under the radar. Yeah, I noticed it the other day. Yeah, it's an interesting book.
Well, now listen to this. This is an actual quotation, and I'll read it, and then I'll tell you who said it. But listen carefully to what this person is actually saying. You'll recognize who it is once I say the name right away.
Okay.
Quote, "We see that the old geometers have made a use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from posterity. I well realize that they must have known a kind of mathematics that was very different from today's common one. Not that I think they knew it perfectly. And indeed, some traces of this true mathematics seem to me still to appear in Pappus et Diopantagus, who, though not belonging to the most ancient ages, lived many centuries before our times. I would also think that later on it was suppressed by its very authors because of a certain wicked slyness," unquote. Now, guess who that was?
Newton?
No, that was Descartes.
That was Descartes. But both of them were aware of the ancient...
Well, hang on. What Descartes has just said. Now, let's remember who Descartes is. This is the guy that has invented analytical geometry, basically laid the foundations for linear algebra, all right? And what he's telling you is, I'm reading these ancient mathematicians, and I think they had a form of analysis that is lost to us.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
And that has been suppressed. Okay.
Oh, yeah, even suppressed. So it's not even just suppressed. That it's lost, but they don't want us to know about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, here's another quotation. Quote, "To be sure, the ancients' method is more elegant by far than the Cartesian one, for Descartes achieved the result by an algebraic calculus which, transfused into words following the practice of the ancients in their writings, would prove to be so tedious and entangled as to provoke nausea, nor might it be understood. but they accomplished it by certain simple propositions, judging that nothing written in a different style was worthy to be read, and in consequence, concealing the analysis by which they found their construction, unquote. Now, guess who that was?
It was Newton and...
That was Newton.
That was Newton, okay. Yeah.
That was Newton. And again, what's he saying? Well, if you look at these ancient mathematicians, they've got some form of analysis which they've concealed from us.
Yeah, so he agreed.
Yeah. And this is one of the inventors of the calculus here, folks. Yeah. All right, now here's the whopper. This is the one I think that really came very close to recognizing what I've been calling topological metaphor. He says, quote, "The ancients seem to have recognized and possessed such an analysis proper to geometry, for in their works I think I can make out some vestiges of it, namely," listen carefully, "namely of an algebra in which numbers are not the issue. Certainly it is by this art that they unfolded those propositions, otherwise we would not have had them for such a long time, which only with difficulty would we find by using our modern methods. I think I've attained and discovered the foundation and first lineaments of this art, with which we can obtain everything else by an imitation of calculating. And with no need to follow the lines with our imagination, a result which I am not sure the ancients ever attained," unquote. Now, guess who that was? That was Leibniz, the other inventor of the calculus. Yeah. So in other words, he's telling you something even beyond what Descartes and Newton are telling you.
You can use the mathematical language for other areas than maths.
Exactly. He's saying that there is a symbolic way. Yeah. There is a way of symbolizing pure analysis. And in fact, Leibniz actually in his writings, if you really dig into him, came up with what he called analysis situ. In other words, analysis of the situation, which is as close to topology as any 17th century mathematician came. And again, he also came up with the idea of what he called a characteristica universalis, a universal characteristic or a universal calculus that would allow you to move in any discipline with ease. And of course, he was busily trying to invent this. And I suspect that what they are looking at is the same thing of what I've been calling topological metaphor, this idea of a nothing that is differentiated and information added to the system that is ultimately driving creation, that is analogical in nature, that is modeling simultaneously not only nature but thought itself. So it's a very, very interesting thing that they're suggesting, because all three of them are also suggesting that this was suppressed for some reason. Yeah.
Before you take it further, because oh my God, there's so many. Despite my hangover, I have so many associations here. We can't touch them all. But although everything you're saying is, for me, easy to follow, if we just divided what you were saying in simple sentences, but it's all have to come together. So let me see here. I'm thinking that if we use the topological as a metaphor, you're basically using the geometrical approach. And like Pythagoras said, in the beginning, God geometrized. Now, you're saying something very important here, and that is through symbol. Because when I look in history, what I see is that all religions, or better philosophical systems, and especially the oldest ones all over the world, the older they get, the more similar they are. Yeah. They use symbolism as the way to convey this. They are not intellectualizing it as you and I am doing now by discussing it. Right. Because this is so abstract that it's, you have the saying in English that a picture says more than 1,000 words, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Now, a symbol says more than 1,000 pictures. So when you get at this deeper level, we kind of leave the rational cognition and we come into a much more creative way of thinking. And if we use math as a language, because like the scientists say that if there was one language that could be understood by any kind of life form, no matter where in the cosmos you are, no matter where in the dimensions you are. It would be math.
Right.
And math is an expression of symbolism.
Yes.
So let's see here. What you're talking about is actually the creation. Because I see this thing in all creational systems, and I see it even in the Judeo-Christian system where they talk about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's
Exactly.
the same thing. In Indian, they talk about Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva. The same in Egyptian, Isis, Osiris, and Harpocrates. So it's space, and space has 3 dimensions.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it goes straight from nothing to 3, and it bypasses 2.
Right,
bypasses
yes.
2. And the Pythagoreans said, they call it, in the more superficial accounts, it was evil.
Well,
they avoided 2.
well,
because 2 didn't exist in nature, they said.
Even in some of the Greek fathers, you have the expression in St. Gregory of Nazianzus when he's talking about the Trinity.
Yeah.
He actually says there is no middle step of 2.
Right. It's an evil dualism.
It's a dualism that is not there. So the other thing about this metaphor is, in a certain sense, you're creating not a binary system. You're creating a ternary sort of logical system.
But actually it's 4, because first you have 0, which is in its own worth something, which is nothing. Then you have 1, God awakens from his sleep, from 0 to 1. 0 and 1 is actually the same. It's just the only difference between 0 and 1 is the dot in the middle of the circle, right? That's the only, it's the I awakening. So you have 0 and you have 1, which is the same, but there are 2 different states of the same, right? So, and then you go from 1 to 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you have 2 just as a conceptual bridge between 1 and 3. That means 4 altogether.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the other interesting, odd thing about this metaphor, because when you start looking at it or playing with it, it actually gives rise to numbers.
Exactly.
So, in other words, in the order of concepts of this thing, this is the other part of the metaphor that's so fascinating, is that there is an order of concepts and how and when they emerge. Yeah. So, and that's, that whole thing is a very Egyptian idea, you can go back.
Yeah. My approach to this, before I noticed you wrote about it, has been the Egyptian, Greek, the numbers approach.
Right.
And I concede the geometrical approach is just as valid, if not better. So there we have 2 different ways to understand these things.
Yeah,
even there.
The metaphor. It's important that people understand that the metaphor is a metaphor. In other words, it's yet another analogy for something that ultimately transcends analogy. But we humans can only talk about things analogically. So, it kind of explains, it's a both and situation. It kind of explains that whole process in itself. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. Symbols are absolutely key and crucial here. And this is why, at least in my approach to try and symbolize this whole thing, I chose topology as the way to do it. Because it has, again, with that empty hyperset symbol in mathematical notation, that's almost a perfect symbol because it's a 0 with a line through it. So in other words, you're not even willing to go to the idea of 0 as being adequate for this. It's the old expression of a famous Eastern Orthodox saint by the name of Gregory Palamas, who just throws most people into a tailspin, because he'll say things like, well, if the world exists, God does not, and if God exists, the world does not.
Because you have the same problem with the 0, because as soon as you have this encircling line, this circle, right? Then you have something, then you have limited it.
Yeah, exactly.
So 0 should really be nothing, but then you can't use it practically because there's nothing there.
So it's a very, very rich concept, and symbols. I think it was Schwaller de Lubitsch that pointed out that the Egyptian hieroglyphs are really symbols of this whole analogical process, because you have to sit and study them.
Yeah.
You can't just look at them and look them up in a dictionary and say, well, this symbol means this. No,
it's not learning by memorization.
Because these ancient languages, the academic term for it is paranomasia, which means that they function on a multitude of levels simultaneously.
Could you repeat that word?
Paranomasia.
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 So para means over,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the root word for the rest there?
Words.
Ah, right, beyond words, yeah.
It's the idea of conveying a multitude of levels at the same time. In other words, ancient languages are designed, so to speak, if I can draw yet another analogy, to be rather similar to, let's say, a fugue by Bach.
Right.
They're functioning on a multitude of levels independently, but simultaneously, harmoniously with each other. In other words, it's not simply one melody propped up by a chord with, a drum beat in the background. That's the way most of us think of language, functioning on one level to convey one level of meaning.
Yeah.
But if you've studied ancient texts, the difficulty is that you're dealing with languages that were trying to convey multiple levels of meaning at the same time.
Yes.
This is my big beef, quite honestly, with modern Bible translations, because the translational philosophy is to convey the simplest meaning that's there. But if you look at the Greek of the New Testament, you're oftentimes confronted with expressions that carry two or three or more meanings simultaneously.
Yeah, like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I know that if you look at the original Greek word for word,
right.
I forgot what that word was, but it's actually logos in the original Greek. The problem with logos is that if they meant the word as a colloquial expression of something you're saying, right? They wouldn't use logos. They would use this other Greek word that I forgot.
They'd use the word rima for that.
Yeah. Whereas logos can mean idea.
Yes.
It can mean law.
Yes.
It can mean teaching. It can mean so many things.
Yes.
And let me just quickly interject too that if you look at the so-called holy languages, the ancient languages, you'll see that, like in the hieroglyphs, you see that one letter is an expression of a number, of a sound, of a meaning, of a word, of an image. I mean, they have these multi-layers. So how do we know? So that means that any text you have, and the same goes for runes, the same goes for Sanskrit. It means that any text you have can have a multiple layer of meaning they want to convey to us.
Absolutely. And
it gets lost by the academicians usually.
Well, it gets lost because our culture is not, if I can use the analogy, our culture is not a contrapuntal culture. And again, I've said many times to people on the website, in the members area, in various interviews, that if you are able to listen intelligently to, let's say, the music of a Bach, you are much more able, because you're listening to several independent lines of music moving together. You are much more able to approach these ancient languages and listen to them in the same way, because that's what they're doing. They're contrapuntal languages. They are moving on several different staves of the score, so to speak, at the same time.
So your training in playing Bach and listening to Bach has actually helped your understanding of this metaphor.
Absolutely.
Because he applies the same principles music-wise.
Oh, absolutely. He not only applies them, but I'll go you one further. You probably haven't got to that part of Thrice Great Hermetica, but I spent some time in that book with the two Bachs that I so adore, Johann Sebastian and Carl Philipp Emanuel. The reason I spent the time with them is because I wanted to point out to people that when you read the music theory texts of that era in Germany, they are full of alchemical terms.
Right.
So in other words, you're listening to a kind of musical alchemy when you're listening to.
It's true. So many musicians in Germany at the time,
Oh yeah,
were either, for instance, they were Masons,
yes,
or they studied these spiritual doctrines.
right.
So yeah, there would be, and many of them composed plays meant to convey a ritual
Sure.
approach to this.
Absolutely.
What you call a topological metaphor.
Absolutely. You know, when they talk about the idea of a motif, you know, and then Bach will use the term Fortspinnung, spinning it forth. In other words, picking out all the latent meaning in that musical form. When they talk about permutation or transmutation of a motif, they're using deliberately alchemical words to describe an intelligible, rational process that they are bringing to their music. So this is why you have the idea in that era of affect, A-F-F-E-K-T in the German. It's a very peculiar word because what it means is what they're trying to do is come up with precise musical formulae to convey an objectified emotion, a kind of platonic emotion. Wow. It's an emotion that the composer, the performer, and listeners all enter into. So in other words, it's not simply like the Romantic era composers. They're not trying to communicate their subjective perspective on something. They're trying to enter into a much more objective experience.
And the same was done by the great painters, by the way.
Oh, absolutely.
Raphael, Michelangelo, just another medium, the visual medium. But would you say then that this ingenious music system was kind of actually, you could call it a kind of a scientific instrument to influence the consciousness?
Yeah, there's that's a very, very profound observation, I think, because it was echoed by Sir John Eliot Gardner did this little documentary of the life of Johann Sebastian Bach, and in it he interviews a variety of people. And he interviewed, I believe it was a mathematician at Cambridge, and she said something that just floored me, that was so dead on. She said, well, J.S. Bach is a scientist and a mathematician who's chosen to work in the language of music. And it's the same, you know, Michelangelo, Raphael, Rembrandt, Poussin, Velasquez, all of these people are taking that very same similar sort of hermetic approach to this and applying these very abstract concepts in a very deliberate, well thought out way in the craft of their art. And it's very difficult, you know, with the modern culture that we only listen to each other or to our music on one level and listen merely as passive receptors to someone else's quote unquote subjective artistic vision.
I think you can withdraw the word artistic from there, but yeah.
Well, yeah.
Subjective.
In many cases, not all of them, but in many cases.
No, but for me, art is being a magician. It is to lift you in touch with the essence of existence, like these people did. And I'd venture that the painters were actually using the topological metaphor more than the musicians, because...
Well, this is particularly true. It's particularly true in the sacred geometry that you can find in Michelangelo or Nicolas Poussin.
Because music uses time. Like Pythagoras said, music is numbers in time, whereas geometry is numbers in space. And so the spatial approach is easier to understand from a visual approach. And the musical is a more masculine. That's more time, the time component, as I see it.
But it's the same principle that we're seeing, you know, the sacred geometry, you know, being so many years in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you look at an Orthodox icon and they're full of it, you know, they're very deliberately.
Yeah, and Islamic even, and Coptic.
And even, absolutely. You find this over and over.
And the Celtic Church?
The Celtic Church, absolutely. You find it everywhere. If you know what you're looking for. I think personally, since you've mentioned the Pythagoreans, there is a thesis that I've had for a number of years, and I'll just crawl way out onto the twig of speculation here and toss it out there for people to think about. Our Western system of music, our tonal system of music, is, I think, first of all, Hermetic music. In other words, it's based on the idea of the harmonic series. If you go back, say, 1,000 years into history, you do not hear the same quality, the same sound in the music. And the reason why is that they had not figured out how to tweak the harmonic series, the basic, nature-given harmonic series, in such a way that would allow you to move in the course of one piece of music from one key to another.
Right. So just let me dumb this down. A musician at that time had to stop. If he was to play a modern song, he had to stop,
right,
then recalibrate his instrument, and then keep playing.
Right.
Because he couldn't tune it.
Right, exactly. When they found out how to do this, beginning, during the Renaissance, that's when modern Western tonal music was born. And it's not accidental it's coming out of the Renaissance, because that's the outbreak into the public awareness of Hermetic principles. So let's go back to the Pythagoreans. If you look at the Pythagorean musical system, the Pythagorean theory of music, they discovered this. They pointed this discrepancy in the nature-given harmonic series very early on. They called it the Pythagorean comma. And if you research it, it's all about music. How do we tune the instrument so that we can function in any given key without having to retune the instrument? So in other words, what I think happened was the Pythagoreans actually discovered this modern system of Western music that we take for granted. That's been the basis of music from Bach to the Beatles. I think they discovered this, and this was one of their huge secrets. That was
and it was so serious to them that
absolutely.
That and the reason wasn't in order just to sit and listen to good music. Although Pythagoras is said to have discovered how you can influence consciousness through music. But the reason was precisely because this is a metaphor to so much deeper truths.
Well, yes, it's a cosmological system.
Yeah.
And they knew this. They understood this.
Or as you actually admitted in a Bite Show once, you said straight out, I remember now, you said this may be the first attempt in known history for a unified field theory.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason why is, again, the natural harmonic series has to be mathematically tweaked. In other words, it's as if nature is presenting us with a mystery. Can we solve it? And I think very early on that the Pythagoreans realized with their understanding of the comma that this was the mystery. And if it could be resolved by geometric mathematical means, which of course is how it was eventually resolved, that you would have a system of tonal music that would unlock a huge cosmological secret. So when I say that Western music, by tempering the harmonic series, it unlocked a cosmological key because it unified all of the overtone systems of the auditory part of the scale, and then provides a clue to, well, can we do this with the entire harmonic series, not only in the auditory scale, but the electromagnetic frequency scale?
Exactly. Now, can I just interject a translation here to people who are at my level? Because I'm really, the only reason I'm following you now is that I've studied this in both your expression and otherwise. Otherwise, I would be lost right now. So let me try to dumb this down then. Because people may say, oh yeah, but music influences, but only to a limited degree, because people with lighters and concerts and stuff, yes, you can cry when you listen, but no, this is much deeper. Now, granted, first is scientific fact that everything in existence vibrates. That you can't get away from that, right?
Exactly.
So if everything vibrates, then you have to understand what is the law of vibration? How does movement, vibration affect each other? Now, if you start to understand the laws of vibration, then you could start to understand the system of magic, which is that similarities influences each other. You have the resonance principle, the dissonance principle, the harmonics and stuff like that. Now, what you're saying is that if you can decode these things via music, and by the way, if everything vibrates, then everything actually has a sound.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that we necessarily can hear the sound. And I won't even go into the philosophical thing about the tree in the forest, but let's just agree upon that even planets make a sound. It's just that in order for us to hear it, we have to translate the range of vibrations into an auditorial range of vibrations, which is limited. Granted, cats can see some higher frequencies, dogs can hear some higher frequencies, bats. So it's not similar for all creatures, but we have more or less the same range of audible range. Now, if you know how this works within the auditorial system, you can influence other ranges of vibrations, like you're saying, the electromagnetical range.
Yes.
And that's when you actually have both a very heavy system of, you could call it magic, or a system of science, because it's the same thing, basically. Yeah. It's how to understand how stuff works against each other.
Yeah, it's a system of analogical magic, if you will. Resonance is kind of the scientific term for basically what the ancients would have considered magic.
Right.
And it's very interesting to note within the Western esoteric tradition, if you read grimoires, the magician is told to vibrate the names that they're invoking, rather. In other words, you're not simply told to speak them.
No.
You're told to vibrate them. So in other words,
and in the Samothracian mysteries, to be a high priest, it wasn't enough just to know the words and the tones and the sounds. You had to be an adept in vibrating them. You had to have a voice, actually. Right. And now we go back to ancient Egypt, and I agree with you. The original pyramid was most probably a machine, most probably made by auditorial effects, most probably also somehow created auditorial effects. But even after they lost this Atlantean knowledge, so to speak, they kept the high priests preserved a ritualistic, probably losing many layers of meaning, but retaining a layer of meaning when it came to sound, because they used the pyramids in the decaying areas after it was a machine, when it was just a remnant. They used it for acoustical purposes too, in their mystery dramas. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you're dealing, particularly with Egypt, I think you're dealing with a legacy civilization where this knowledge has declined somewhat, but the basic principles and premises have been preserved. And you find this idea of tuning, so to speak, the universe, even in the modern plasma physicist David Bohm. I wrote about him in Babylon's Banksters, because what he was attempting to do was calculate the mathematical equivalent of the Pythagorean comma and apply it to the entire harmonic series. What is the exact mathematical interval that will allow us, so to speak, to move from one key to another in any frequency range of the entire spectrum? So in other words, again, he had this understanding that if there was going to be that kind of unification in physics, it wasn't going to come about by cramming together relativity and quantum mechanics. It was going to come about by some sort of frequency analysis and unification along those lines. So I've always thought he's one of my favorite physicists, because he had these kinds of sort of, so to speak, mystical insights.
Yeah, and I say it's not a coincidence that Pythagoras and many other great ancient thinkers were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. But when you mentioned this thing, do you think it's a coincidence then? I mean, I would say that quantum physics, no, actually I would say that superstring theory is Pythagoreanism on steroids.
Yeah, in a certain sense it is, because it's nothing but a theory of vibrations in two dimensions, of things on the scale of the Planck length. Right. And when you even before superstring theory, if you go back to some of these very early attempts at unified field theories, Einstein, Kaluza, people that were playing with these theories back in the 20s and 30s. When you look at them, it's very interesting that they've all got certain things in common. They've all got a geometric approach in common. In other words, how do we take the geometry of electromagnetism, which is kind of a donut, if you will, and general relativity, which is kind of a ball with surrounding three-dimensional space warps, and put these two geometries together to come up with a unified field theory. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at Kaluza and his very early first attempt to do this, one of the interesting things is that fourth spatial dimension is in vibration. So in other words, even in these types of approaches, you still can't get rid of this idea of pardon me, of vibration. Pardon me. So you get this idea in the way I'm approaching it is if you take two sets, mathematical sets, and fill them up with members that they both have in common, what would distinguish them would be the phase that they're in, the vibration that they're in. And I think, again, this is a possible way of perhaps explaining astrology and the fact that, we're born at a certain place and time with certain planets in certain positions. This is going to create, if you will, a systemic vibration that imprints itself on you at the moment of birth. And so when planets return to approximately the same types of things, it's going to be like hitting overtones on your natural personal overtone series, so to speak. And you're going to be kind of in sync during those times. And, at other times you're not going to be so in sync. We all experience this. But my point here is I think that there's perhaps an underlying physics basis to all of this that we have yet really to understand or even examine because, of course, all of this is just pseudoscience, And
No, but let me quickly rationalize it, because the modern approach to understanding how there can be a correlation between planetary harmonics, so to speak, and what happens on Earth is very simply, before they thought magical, they thought, okay, the planet is beaming a ray onto my skull.
Right.
But now they're looking at it more like, if everything vibrates, there are structures.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's the point with vibration. It's a structure of movement. Now
it creates an interferometry pattern, and that.
Yeah. So you kind of look at the sky as a clock. So it's like, okay, if I'm born at 2:00, now the planets will have this eternal correlation, and what happens on Earth will have this internal correlation.
Right.
And both of them are following a deeper root cause. So
right.
it's not that the planet itself is sending a beam to you. It's that the planet responds to the same thing that the atmosphere down here on Earth responds to, which is this deeper causal topological metaphor.
Yeah, it's responding to a structure of information in that field of nothing, so to speak.
Right.
And when that structure comes around again, or comes around in close,
it's 2:00 again. Yeah,
exactly. It's going to have those types of resonance effects. So, this is deep stuff, and it's as far as I think, Al, I think we're looking at the beginning of a very different kind of science, because there have been hints in the literature, as I've tried to point out in the books. There have been hints of serious scientists actually looking at this stuff and making these types of deep correlations. And of course,
like who would you mention who are onto it?
Easily. There's a fellow back during the 1950s by the name of Nelson that worked for RCA. And RCA hired him to find out, why is it that at certain times of the year our shortwave reception is so much worse than others? And he found amazing correlations between planetary oppositions. And, then that's an astrological term, whether we want to admit it or not. He found that when planets were in positions of grand crosses, for example, that shortwave reception was interfered with. And, he published this and was roundly denounced for, indulging in astrology and so on.
No, but the study of cycle is a decent science.
Cycles itself. The study, Herbert Hoover hired Edward Dewey to study why we keep having these boom and bust cycles. And Dewey, having the resources of the U.S. Department of Commerce available to him, just started to put it all together, and he discovered that there are enormous long wave cycles. Well, what are waves? Well, they're vibrations.
Yeah. And
he was so fascinated by this that he founded the Society for the Study of Cycles and just started collecting data on every imaginable type of cycle that you could conceive of. And again, it's a case of dealing with waves, with frequencies, with phases, and so on and so forth. But
if it's anything the ancient did in their science, that it was to map cycles, phases.
Precisely. And again, what did the ancients tell us? You go back to some old Egyptian texts, some old Babylonian texts, and they'll both
South America, the sun cycles.
They'll tell you that these observations were compiled over thousands of years. In other words, what they're telling you is that the basis of their so-called, pseudoscience of their astrology was based on observation of tremendous amounts of data over a tremendous amount of time. And I'm enough of a text person that when texts tell me something, I tend to take them seriously, particularly when they tell me something like that. And when you look at that statement and then look at Dewey, doing all of his work for Herbert Hoover after the Great Depression, then you begin to see that, my word, for about 3,000 years, we have not paid any attention to this in any really meaningful scientific way. We're just starting, in other words, to try and understand all of this stuff and make some rational scientific sense out of it. So, I'm firmly foursquare against those who would just knee-jerk react to this and say, well, that's just pseudoscience. No, it's not. It's just something that we haven't paid much attention to until very, very recent times. And therefore, our approximations now are going to be clumsy. They're going to be out of the ballpark. We've got to start taking a much closer look at these things. I do think, I don't know if you've got to that part in the third way yet, but I do think that this is one of those secret projects that they are busily looking at, is data correlations between different systems and their cycles.
Yeah, because I was thinking about also scientists like Hoagland's favorite, what's his name, Kosarev, torsion.
Oh yes, absolutely.
These guys that are into the free energy stuff, that they're onto this too. Because you can't avoid it. If you're going to have a unified field theory, you can't avoid it.
Yeah, because the other thing about this approach is that what you're really saying is that there's no such thing as a closed system.
Right.
All systems are open to each other, and that brings us again back to this metaphor. Because again, if you're starting from that initial undifferentiated nothing and then you start differentiating it, that means that in each and every formal description of each and every differentiation, that original nothing remains in the description itself. So that's telling you that every system is open to every other system that results from this process.
I just had a realization. Let me share it with you. I'll do it quick.
Sure.
In quantum, Amit Goswami said in an interview with him recently that it's so insane now in quantum physics that if there's no observer there to observe it, then per definition it only exists potentially. It doesn't really exist. So in other words, you have to have a self-conscious ingredient for it to actually manifest in existence. Now, let's translate this to the topological metaphor. In the beginning, let's say there's nothing. Let's translate that metaphorical to there's God sleeping. So God exists in the way that there is something, but there's nothing, because like quantum physics says, you have to have self-consciousness. There has to be something that knows that it's observing. So if you're sleeping, like Amit Goswami said, if you're sleeping and there's no one else alive around you, in that area. Per definition, that area doesn't really exist in the objective world as we understand it. As soon as you awaken, it does exist again. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to wrap your head around it. But let's take that at face value. That means that when there is nothing, there is God sleeping. When God awakens, then there is something. Mm-hmm. And is that when we can say that limits are coming in, that differentiation, that's God observing itself, God being, quote unquote, poetically speaking, lonely, and wanting to, and nothing can exist outside of yourself. So within itself, it differentiates, it makes a mirror of itself as above, so below, and then you get you don't get two as you would think. You would think, okay, I get a circle and then a copy of that circle, like an 8, so to speak. No, but both of these things are taking place within the bigger circle of God, both sleeping and being awake, which means you get 3. Well, sorry for the rambling, but I'm so engaged. No.
Yeah. There's one caution here to place on this, and that is that observation in that view then becomes a defining characteristic of God. Right. And what the metaphor is saying is that there is absolutely no prior reason or rational principle to this undifferentiated nothing. So in other words, we can't say if it's asleep, it's awake, and so on and so forth. Nor can we say that it's inside or outside of time, or any of these other things, because these are all products of differentiation.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting if you look at this metaphor carefully, closely. That first differentiation itself is very, very interesting, because what it is, in physics terms, is describing a systems state change. Now, the question at that point is that a system state change inside or outside of time? Because that's what time is really measuring, is a system state change. Right. Well, again, the problem here is it's a both and. Because you can't say that it began to be, and you cannot say that it didn't begin to be. So, in other words, what the metaphor is doing here is it's showing us again that ultimately our concepts that we bring to it
break down.
Break down. This is why you find in Western Christian mystical theology, and by Western here I'm including the Eastern churches as well, you find this idea of the via negativa, the negative way. In other words, you clear away for union with God, you clear away every category that you can, but yet at the same time they'll tell you that you can't. Precisely, you can't, and they'll also tell you that you cannot do that without the via analogia, without the way of analogy. So in other words, those twin things always work together. To forget one is to forget the other.
But let's examine it a bit closer here, because nothing. Let's look at the word emptiness or absence. Mm-hmm. That's actually something, because that's vacuum. Mm-hmm. But if I have my hands in a vacuum, I put my hands into a vacuum box, and the hands are separated. You could say that technically there's nothing between my hands, but there's still something. But that something is still, it's emptiness. That something is emptiness, is absence. Mm-hmm. How do we wrap our head around this?
Again, it's a both and. This is why this metaphor is so very perplexing to people, because people are used to thinking in a what I call an either or dialectical way. It's either this or it's that. And the problem with the metaphor is, and I keep telling people this, is it's a both and. This is why it's a 3-based structure rather than a 2-based structure. It's not a dualistic structure, in other words. And this is what's so very, very frustrating to people, to wrap their head around that.
Yeah, but they can understand it in examples,
right?
Because that gives the analogical learning. Let's say photons. Einstein say that you cannot travel faster than light. Now, what we know is that every particle in existence is dual, except for photons. So if you are going to break the speed of light, which is obviously possible, then the vibrations have to withdraw from the world of polarity and coming into this singular state, which transcends the dualism.
Even there, you see what the metaphor is also doing is it's a very non-local phenomenon. Because as I've said, in every formal description of every derivative, you have the presence of that symbolic notation of the nothing that begins the process, all right? So in other words, the idea of open systems, another way of saying that, is that every system is entangled with every other system. So you're dealing also with something at root that is profoundly non-local, to use the physics term. So photon entanglement, the way I'm looking at it or understanding it or attempting to understand it, I should say, is that this is yet another manifestation of the metaphor in action. Because whether we like it or not, photon entanglement in a kind of simplistic way violates that faster than light transference of information that Einstein said was impossible. Well, if it's impossible, we've got a huge philosophical problem. Because we're living in the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy is 400,000 light years from one edge to the other in diameter. And yet it's a coherent structure, obviously, when you look at it. And you look at other galaxies of similar size, Andromeda, it's a coherent spiraling structure. Well, that structure, how is that held together if you cannot have faster than light transference of information? So there's some other thing at work that has to hold this all together. I mean, these types of philosophical problems are the huge philosophical problems squatting right in the middle of cosmological physics. And even beyond that now, astronomers in the last few decades have discovered the fact that there are whole galactic clusters of galaxies that are kind of clumped together in these.
But even logic, even logic could help us realize that there has to be a strata of existence not within time space, because if we are to travel from here to Andromeda, let's say, then it cannot be within the 4 dimensions of light. It has to be that you're stepping out of the whole existence, and then you're stepping into the whole existence at another place, like teleportation. And they Einstein and Nathan Rosen, I think, were the first people who were onto this. They said that that black holes are, and now it's gotten a renaissance. They say that black holes are actually exits from this kind of existence, and they're speculating that quasars are entrances, so to speak, from in this hyperspace, or whatever you want to call it, this meta. No, so I'm saying everything shows us, we cannot travel through space without also traveling through time. That means that we're stepping out of the whole polarity existence. So there is another strata to existence. And if it's like you're saying, if you say, okay, we cannot surmise anything in the beginning, before the beginning, then my only metaphoric explanation for existence is this. Let's say that you and I, we live in the future and we can connect ourselves to computers. But not only that, we can even forget that when we are playing with our avatars in the connected computer system, we can forget that we are actually sitting and playing, like The Matrix. You remember the plot of the movie The Matrix. And so as soon as we start our computers and enter our avatars, that's when existence begins. And the reason I'm using this metaphor is that quantum scientists are now saying they're saying it's not a metaphor. They're saying, some of them are actually saying that we are in a holographic space, and that we are beings, entities who are not present within this 4-dimensional space. We are not somewhere else, but we are somehow else, and we are playing through these these life forms.
Right.
How do you relate to all this? You probably heard
Well,
it.
I actually relate to that rather well, and I think most religious and mystical traditions have some similar view, their own metaphorical ways of expressing this. But certainly, I take that view simply because I'm one of those stubborn curmudgeons that simply does not accept the idea that the human mind is located inside the brain.
Right.
I'm one of those people that also, being a stubborn curmudgeon, does not believe that our individual personhood is simply the sum total of our memories, emotions, will, and so on and so forth. In other words, even personhood itself is an indefinable entity. It's very much one of those nothings or no things, because our absolute uniqueness really predates, so to speak, our participation in this world. We had a very interesting philosophical discussion on precisely this topic in our last members vid chat on my website, and one member proposed the idea that every person enters the world with a topological space, so to speak, assigned to them with all of the multitudes of choices that we face during our lifetimes, and we make our way through it like a process of what a mathematician would call tessellation. We make certain choices that take us in one direction and not another.
Yeah, but through several lifetimes, or just within a lifetime?
Well, within a lifetime. But if you accept that idea, then what you're really saying is that, and I've said this many, many times, that we sort of, so to speak, transduce our personhood into this existence. That again, we're dealing with open systems. What we do in this life influences and affects that ground state, so to speak, that our personality that is existing somehow differently in a deeper strata, and that in turn affects what we do in this life. So again, I think we're on the cusp of things here. We're not at the end of a scientific development, because what I see going on, I think, in some aspects of physics is exactly what you're seeing, in that they now are coming to the point of realizing that consciousness plays a much huger role in the material world, and that this
morphogenetic fields and all that.
Right, exactly. Than the materialistic, simplistic 19th century
mechanic
science would have us believe. I have it up in my members area, a webinar on some scientific research that was done by Dr. William Tiller. Now, if you get a chance, look at that webinar, because this guy was, I should say, a professor of materials science, of all things, at the University of California.
Of all things, yes.
Yeah, of all things. And what he did was he performed a set of experiments of, can conscious intention that is very specifically spelled out affect or modify materials in the physical world with no physical contact of any sort? And lo and behold, it does. He performed a variety of experiments, very interesting stuff. But again, this is what all of this is telling me, is that we're at the end of a philosophical period of development that has ruled Western culture and science basically on the materialistic side of things. And what we're entering into now is a period of the beginning of a different scientific paradigm, where the interface between the immaterial world, the world of consciousness, the world of mind, and so on, is going to be investigated for its connections to the material world. How do these two really relate to each other? And what really caught my attention with Tiller's work was that he used, in some of his equations, he used the mathematical symbol for proportion, for ratios. And this, to me, again, takes us right back to ancient cosmology, even the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, as you mentioned earlier, that we're dealing with a world where there is a rational principle that enters into it from outside of it. And orders it, and that, the Latin version of the Gospel of St. John, the beginning of it, is very interesting because they translate the word logos there by the Latin word ratio. And ratio, of course, is ratio, reason, proportion. So in other words, this whole thing implies, again,
so in the beginning was the idea, and the idea was with God, and the idea was God. That makes a lot of sense.
It's the idea of, in the beginning there was ratio. If you want to go
ratio
to that level.
Yeah, you can put that in.
So I think we're on the cusp of these types of investigations. We're not at the end of an era, in other words, is what I'm suggesting. We're at the beginning of a different one.
Right.
I think in that respect, this whole transhumanist movement is going to come a cropper, as the British say, because it's based so. It's the last gasp, so to speak, of materialism.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to come a cropper of some nasty things that they're probably going to find out as they start tinkering with all of this stuff that is going to point them in a very different direction. But the physicists, as you say, they're already doing this when they're saying that we live in a holographic universe, or we live in a simulation, we're all avatars, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but I want to go further, because the transhumanism thing we can talk about in another program, because that's such a huge topic.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
It's a very negative energy, but
yes, I agree with you.
What you're saying here about modern science, it sounds like the snake biting its own tail, because it sounds like modern. That was a symbol, and literally it means that modern scientists are actually coming back to the Gnostics.
Well, they're coming back. I think they're coming back to something that's even in a certain sense deeper than that, because I think what they're getting back to, physics back in the 17th and 18th century was called natural philosophy.
Right.
It wasn't called physics. It was called natural philosophy. So in other words, this is why you have a Newton or a Descartes or a Leibniz writing massive amounts of philosophical works, or in Newton's case, trying to figure out what the prophecy in the book of Daniel is all about. But, what they're really doing is they're trying to synthesize knowledge in a gigantic sort of way. And they're coming back to this. So I think what we're also seeing is kind of not so much the death of physics, but the transformation of physics back into natural philosophy. And by the same token, you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake and morphogenetic fields. I think you're seeing the same thing happen in biology, and it's high time.
Bruce Lipton and all those, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Mm. Yeah, well, this transformation then, I just perceive it as we're rediscovering what the ancients knew, but that we are putting it into contemporary language with contemporary models of expression that can fit our over-rational way of perceiving the world. This old-fashioned materialism that fortunately is at its last rotten grasp. But let's ponder. Let's just take a break now, and we'll ponder as people let this sink in. And when we come back after the quick break, we'll double down and explore this even deeper.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
And we're back with the forum professor, Dr. Farrell. And finally taking on a more philosophical subject with him. So let's just get right back to it.
Yeah.
I think that poetry, just like symbols is a way to ease our understanding of these complex matters visually, whereas poetry is a way to bypass the the intellect, the emptiness of the ego, and get an intuitive. I want to read for you a poetic little excerpt that is. I can send you later the whole thing because it's too much to read. I'll just read a few sentences, but it's called Cosmogenesis, and I have it not from the internet where people believe everything is. I have it from a private text I got through a mystery school thing, and it's supposedly going back to the ancient, at least the ancient Greeks, and it goes like this. The eternal parent was wrapped in the sleep of the cosmic night. Light there was not, for the flame of spirit was not yet rekindled. Time there was not, for change had not re-begun. Things there were not, for form had not re-presented itself. Actions there was not, for there was no things to act. The pairs of opposites there were not, for there were no things to manifest polarity. The eternal parent, causeless, indivisible, changeless, infinite, rested in unconscious, dreamless sleep. Other than the eternal parent, there was naught, either real or apparent. I'll not read on about how existence comes into being, although that is interesting. But this is just a way to poetically try to explain this nothingness that we struggle so with.
Right.
Comments?
Well, again, it's very interesting in that poem. What you have is the idea that dualism itself is a lesser manifestation of something much more transcendent. In other words, dualism ultimately doesn't work as a cosmology, I think is what that is actually suggesting.
That bodes very ill for artificial intelligence.
It bodes very, very ill for it. Yes, precisely. And we've had that philosophical discussion in the members' vid chats over many.
Wow. I need to go back there and dig more.
Yeah, those vid chats, there's quite a lot of them, but they're worth listening to if you can spare the time and energy to listen to them, because we explore questions like that. And again, I'm in agreement because the problem with computer languages now and with the hardware, quite frankly, is that they're dipole systems, they're dualistic systems, they're binary systems. And this is what has always been the problem as far as the metaphor is concerned, is that they cannot get threeness built into these things. Now, quantum computing may change that to a certain extent, because rather than and or gates in your computers, you're going to have systems based on the 7 states of the electron. So in other words, rather than each neuron...
vibrational.
Yeah, bingo.
That's great.
Bingo. So again, that may change things, and there's indicators that they're playing around with AI in conjunction with this idea of quantum computing.
It's the only solution, actually.
Yeah, if they're going to do it. But, I'm very skeptical of AI for all the reasons that Nick Bostrom and some other people have been cautioning about, because I think it's quite possible that, you turn on a system like that and it transduces that self from the...
Yeah, Frankenstein's monster. This is the oldest...
Yeah, it transduces, right. Lucifer becomes incarnate in your computer, whatever.
Yeah. My computer is already obsessed.
Well, yes. Mine certainly displays a mind of its own on occasion. That's very frustrating. But it's the old Lawnmower Man movie scenario where the evil entity gets into the system and you can't get rid of it. But
especially not when the system is connected with everything that matters in our world.
Exactly.
And I believe as long as they leave out the very important component of life force, either you call it pneuma in Greek, prana, chi, ki, kumra. They have words for this in all traditions. If you leave that component out, you will not get consciousness as we know it.
Right. You're going to
because consciousness is tightly attached to life force.
You're going to get a simulacrum of it, or you're going to get a
Psychopaths, because there's no emotions.
Yeah, you're going to get a psychopath. And it's very interesting, that Lucifer, you look at the way he's described in Ezekiel, for example, thy tabrets and pipes were made perfect in thee. Well, you stop and look at that phrase, tabrets and pipes.
Wow.
Well, that could be a phrase indicative of, a physiology of, intestines and organs and membranes and so on. So,
or the web.
Or a machine.
The web, yes, exactly.
Or a machine,
Yes.
So I find the whole enterprise kind of dubious for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah. Just to begin with, why are we doing it? What need do we have?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why are we so obsessed with...
I volunteer with my consciousness. That's an artificial intelligence. They can use that instead.
Well,
no, it's insane. It's insane.
It is. It's a species of insanity. It's a species of will
and amnesia and insanity.
Amnesia.
Oh my
yes,
God.
I would wholeheartedly agree with the idea of amnesia, because rather than try and create the God without, so to speak, let's try and recover our own personal sense of dignity and connection with the divine.
Yeah. Not daemon ex machina, but
right, exactly.
Homo es Deus. I agree.
Yeah. It's very, very different. And that sounds like an abandonment of Christian principles. It really isn't, because when you read the Greek fathers,
AI is an abandonment of.
Well, AI, yes,
yeah.
but the idea of deification, that's the way the early Christian fathers understood it.
Yeah.
You're not being saved from sin. You're being saved to become like God and to dwell with Him.
But that's very gnostic too.
Yes, of course it is. It's so very pervasive in those ancient cultures that to think that they would think otherwise, it's kind of a misnomer.
No, but I adhere to the approach that if you go back far enough, you will see that all the oldest traditions in existence from all over the globe, actually,
yes.
It'd be the Toltec of the American natives, it'd be the Vajrayana of the Buddhist, it'd be the Tantra, it'd be the Celtic Christianity, Coptic, anything. If you look at the essence of their philosophy, all these people, you'll see that it's so similar. And then there's two ways to explain it. One is that, it is survivals of the ancient pre-Ice Age civilizations understanding. I won't call it religion, but I won't call it science either. It's something in between. It's both. Mm-hmm. So they say, it's because they are remnants, they are survivals. But there's also the other approaches, is that, no, we have all, the Gnostic approach, that we have all a potential direct contact with the source. And indeed, if we are avatars and we are somewhere else, then obviously yes. But I think is actually, and this is my approach, my belief, that it's both. It's both that we can reconnect with a template in cosmos, but it's also that external reminders have survived in symbolism, in mythology, in art, everything.
Yes,
what's
absolutely.
your approach to that?
Well, I would agree with you. It's I'm a both and kind of guy. So
yeah, you're not dualistic. It's not either or.
No, I'm really not. I do think that these things are legacies of what, just like you say, of something that was. If we were to look at it now, if we were to be confronted by it now, we would have difficulty of saying, well, is this a philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it a science? What is it?
As reflected in the technology.
Yeah, exactly. It's all of them. It was, I like to say, it was a very high civilization, and ours isn't. It's getting back there slowly but surely, but it's got a long ways to go. But yeah, I see that this is in part, I think, a legacy of what once was. It may even be, in a certain sense, a Platonic memory that we're vaguely recalling.
In our genes, that's imprinted in us.
It could be that. There's any number of explanations for it. And I don't think that you have to simply devolve upon one to say that that explains it all, because again, I think that's kind of a simplistic approach to things. It's really all of them, and this is why I think this metaphor idea is so very important, because it allows you to look at the basic commonality of structure behind all of these different myths and lore that you have from around the world. They're all saying kind of the same thing, at least in terms of the structure that they're attempting to preserve. They're attempting to preserve it for a reason, and oftentimes they may not even realize the full extent of it. But it's a huge thing that we're involved with. And like I say, I think, Al, that you look back over the course of human development, particularly in the West since the Renaissance, we've just begun. Yeah. Really. We're not at the end of something. We're at the beginning of something. And you can kind of feel it in the air with the panic that you see.
Of the establishment, yeah.
With the establishment, because that establishment has been wedded to this materialistic consumerist philosophy for the last 200 years and is simply collapsing around them. Yeah. Their playbook isn't working anymore. It's crystal clear what they're up to, and they're up to no good.
And people are awakening, despite their efforts.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Richard Hoagland has the expression that he said, I've heard him say many times, that
the lie is different.
This is all due. Yeah, the lie is different at every level, but it's this change that we're going through now, where the good people seem to be getting better and the bad people seem to be getting worse, is that he's maintaining that this is somehow possibly related to a physics. Well, that may be. We're just on the cusp of trying to understand this stuff.
Yeah, there is this new age concept that our solar system, because we know that the galaxy, everything is repeating itself in atoms, in electrons, and in galaxies. So all the solar systems in our galaxy are rotating around a central point of that galaxy, which actually is an old ancient doctrine too. Now, and many New Agers think that because we're now going out from, let's look at it as a clock, actually, a cosmic clock. And let's say that from 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock is a dark period, whereas 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock is a lighter period. Let's compare it to, let's say, winter solstice versus spring equinox. Mm-hmm. Two different phenomenons. And by the way, the ancients, one of the reasons they preserved customs, especially connected to earth, to cultivation of earth stuff, is precisely for philosophical reasons. Right. So what I just said here is an example. So let's say that we have been, our solar system have been in a astrological house, so to speak, in a clock, in a time zone that's been having a little light, and now we're moving into one with more light, and that's why it will force a polarization, because those who are where the spirit is kindled will flame up, and the others will kind of the strong light I have to hide.
Well, yeah, I think there's something to that. For those following the Hindu tradition, we're in the Kali Yuga, which is a really dark, bad time, and I don't think anybody can look at what's happening in the world today and say otherwise. But at the same time, we're in that period of night, and it's going to be very bumpy and get really bad, but at the end of it, you can only stand so much chaos and evil and bad before you just finally get fed up and tired with it and start doing some good things. And this again is why I urge people, you've got to be responsible for preserving all the good things in our culture and handing them down, because even though there have been bad things in Western culture, to be sure, in the main, it has been a very productive, creative culture. Most of the technology that we enjoy is the product of it. Most of the
it's a result of what the Pythagoreans discovered. Yeah. It goes back to there. Yeah. It's not just music, it's everything. It's architecture, everything comes from out of it.
Yeah. We have the idea that we in the West live in the Judeo-Christian culture, which is true, but I would also add that we also live in a humanistic culture, in a kind of hermetic culture.
Egyptian Greek culture, yeah.
And then a Greco-Egyptian culture. And its roots are very, very deep. And to simply jettison those, like the establishment wants us to do, and create this homogenized global porridge, I don't think it's going to be terribly successful. But they're going to try it, and it's going to have bad results, and we just have to kind of get ready for it. But I do think we're in a transitional age, unlike any other in previous known human history. Yeah. So we're at the beginning of something, not the end of something.
Yeah, no, it is a phase, and we see it's interesting in the new generations because they are growing up now with internet as a default. Yeah, and a recent statistic showed that they would rather live without food and a lot of basics than internet.
Yeah, I know.
And I think the exposure to all this information is part of what makes people awake, because before we couldn't know what I can know now whatever happens in most areas of the globe in an instant. Yep. I'm not saying people are actually using that. People are lazy. They are not trying to find out what's going on, but they have the possibility to. Now, another thing is that the negative stuff you mentioned may just be actually that we know about it now because of this transparency, because of this information. So it's not necessarily a sign that, well, the means of being barbaric are more refined. We can now torture and kill people in an instant without, having to do the dirty work of the inquisitors, right? Right. So yeah, but leave all that aside. I wanna double down and take it to a different level. I have a hard question for you. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. This is partly based on something that you talked with Georgianne about once. Mm-hmm. Just to remind you of the area you were talking about, very deep and very dark stuff about the concept of sacrifice. Now, my question for you, so you know where we're going here. My question for you is that in certain obscure esoteric corners, because esoterica is just not just one big happy New Age family where everybody agrees about everything. It's a very old and very diverse and very deep strata. Now, the one I'm referring to, which has different exponents among it, says two things. This is a big reasoning, but I'll shut up and let you get plenty of time to answer this. One of the schools say that we have to, that it is possible to survive death as a conscious being, as an ego, so to speak, with your persona, if you build something called body of light. This has different words in different traditions. Like, I think the Buddhists call it the diamond body, the ancient Hermetists call it the fire body. But they say that the reincarnation principle is real. And by the way, every tradition in the world has talked about reincarnation. Not the same doctrine, but a version of it. Even Christianity has never abandoned reincarnation formally. But we'll not go into this now. So you can survive, but they say you can survive like we believe reincarnation is, that your ego survives, but only if you build the vehicle for it. Now, the second, there's another layer in esoterica that says that much of what's going on here is that for some reason, and I'll not go too deep into it, I'll just take the superficial version, that we have to pay energy. We have to give energy to God for like it's a recycling system. It's that we die and God is boosted, so to speak, and then we're born and God is emptied, so to speak. So that in a way, deaths are a way for the cosmic clock to go on. I'm mentioning these two doctrines because I see a parallel between both of them. Are kind of a minority within the more popular belief, within the same areas. But I also see a parallel between them. And I can mention modern expressions of this is like Gurdjieff when he say that the moon eats souls. Like Plutarch said that when we die, part of us falls back to earth, part of us falls back to the moon, where the psyche goes. The body goes to earth, the psyche goes to the moon, and the spirit goes to the sun. So a more modern version, more materialistic version is when Gurdjieff says that the moon eats souls. And so I've thrown a lot of balls out for you now to juggle with here. So well, I'll shut up and let you comment.
I'm unsure of what you're getting at in relationship to all of this to sacrifice, but
to pay energy when you die.
Okay, when you die, yeah, to make a payment.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing, as far as I can see, with this metaphor, topological metaphor idea, is that you can understand it in two very, very different ways. We're back to that both and way again. And these ways are fundamentally economic, if you will, in nature. The first way is if you look at that initial undifferentiated nothing as a unity, and then look at each of the derivatives as fractions of that unity, then you've got a system that is essentially closed upon itself, and in which each of the entities arriving or deriving in that system owe their existence to the others. And in that type of system...
So it's battle more than sex. It's warfare more than copulation.
Yeah, it's warfare. It's a debt model. It's a sacrifice model. All right, that's one way to look at it. And that way of looking at it has been more or less the way that certain cultures have. The Christian cultures looked at it that way. Some aspects of Brahmanic culture looked at it that way, and so on.
And these people these native Indians, what were they called? The gruesome ones.
Oh, the Aztecs, yes.
Yeah.
Aztecs looked at it that way, as a payment that was owed, and that to a certain extent, as I used to put it to Georgianne, could quite literally shock the medium, or if you will, so they thought, manipulate the gods or manipulate God. The other way of looking at this metaphor is as an open system where that unity is a creative fecundity, if you will, a sex, and you find the sexual metaphors attached to it in various cultures as well. Besides the sacrifice war model, you've also got a sexual creative fecund model.
Absolutely. Egypt, India,
and so on, where the initial undifferentiated nothing produces other versions of itself and multiplies. So in other words, you don't look at that unity as being fractionalized. You look at it as creative. So in other words, you're not creating a fraction 1/4, 1/5, 1/6. You're looking at it as creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, plus economy, marketplace.
Right. It's an open system, and in that system, you don't see this idea of debt. You don't see this idea of sacrifice and so on. Sacrifice takes on a rather different sort of good meaning, that, I'm sacrificing for the good of others, or, I'm making this sacrifice of love.
Yeah, that's self-sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a very different sort of conception. So again, it's the way that people have construed this metaphor, I think, that underlies a lot of it throughout our history.
Right.
I put it in one point as the opposition, so to speak, of the corn god versus the debt, slavery, sacrifice god.
Yeah, the war god.
Yeah, the war god. And it's very interesting, in the Aztec tradition, I pointed out in Grid of the Gods that you had clear statements being made that Quetzalcoatl himself absolutely refused any notion of sacrifice, and that it was the demons that came along and introduced the practice.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
Hancock, by the way, Hancock claims in his novel about this that what's the conquistador top dog? What was his name again?
Oh boy, you would ask that. Cortez.
Yeah, Cortez. He claims that it was the same demon who went to this Indian leader, Aztec leader, who later went to Cortez and claimed he was St. Peter or something like that.
Montezuma, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
It's interesting that in the cultures that have the presence of sacrifice, that you see it emerging after. In other words, the sacrifice interpretation seems to appear later.
So it's a degeneration.
It's a degeneration of some sort. It seems to be the case. But, that's so fraught when you start making those kinds of generalities. That's so fraught with difficulties of, having to examine each and every culture and do so in depth, So it's a generalization.
And it's a question of access to material, too.
Yeah,
most of
absolutely.
it was oral. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, it's a I tell people all the time that there are dangerous aspects of the metaphor, some of which I'll never ever talk about because it can be dangerous. But the sacrifice,
like black magic.
Oh yes,
you don't want to give out the technique.
No. The sacrifice interpretation of the metaphor is an indicator, so to speak, of what some of those things are, and it's just gruesome and dangerous. Unfortunately, I don't know about you, but I look, Al, at some of these stories that we hear occasionally in the media of pedophile scandals, of child sex rings, of sacrifice, actual sacrifice going on that pop up here and there.
Yeah. Sacrificing virgins, that's an old concept.
Yeah, we're looking at these scandals in the UK. We're looking at
the Catholic Church.
We're looking at them in the Franklin scandal in this country and
celebrities.
And celebrities. I think we're looking at a global network of some sort. I really do. That's just an intuition. I'm not basing that on any evidence other than the fact that these stories seem to be so persistent. When they appear, they crop up in this locality or that locality.
Yeah, but see, there could be a spiritual explanation, because one thing is that...
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Because one thing is that they're all in on it, right? But another is that they're just acting on their own negative demonic impulses, and there's some...
It's a power lust.
Not a conspiracy, but a spiritual... I'm not saying either. I'm just saying both are possible.
Oh, yeah. I'm a both-and person, as you know.
Yeah. Oh my God! It's both a conspiracy and they are cooperating with the demons.
Yeah. I have no difficulty. I have no difficulty believing that that there are people that believe that they can gain some sort of power in this fashion and are doing it for that reason.
Yeah.
I have no difficulty believing also that there has to be an element of conspiracy involved with it, simply because if you're going to do that sort of thing, you have to have fellow conspirators.
Obviously.
The real problem that I see is we're looking at something that it does appear to have some sort of international extent. Yeah. And once you realize that, then the question becomes, are we looking at some sort of possible network here? And every intuition that I have in my bones says yes, but I have yet to find any sort of real corroborating evidence for any of that. But
could we say that these people who are philosophically aligned with the status quo, the establishment, the old elites, could we say that the spin on this is that the system is closed, so in order to survive, we need to cannibalize it.
Yeah.
And not only that, but parts of it are more worthy than other parts. So we will sacrifice parts of our body or hands or feet, so that the brain will survive or something like that. So it's a crazy, and without realizing that they're actually in a system that could multiply itself if it imitated God, that it could just increase and increase and increase without being less, because as you know, it's the hologram principle.
Yeah, I think you're onto it right there when you said cannibalism, and cited Plutarch and Gurdjieff, that this is their operating principle. This is their cosmology. And I've said it before many times. The establishment elites are people that really cannot think in any other way, because they're dumbed down themselves. They've been the victims of their own dumbing down of other people.
And they've been at the receiving end of this system, so that for them it's good.
Yeah, exactly. So, they can't think in any other way. And this process of cannibalization, as you put it very aptly, I think, is precisely what you see in so much of the transhumanist movement. If you look behind the language, what they're really telling you is, we want to survive and we're willing to sacrifice anything else in order to make that possible, including parts of our own body.
Yeah. And they do it the demonic way.
Yeah.
Instead of doing it the spiritual way that all religions and avatars have claimed, that you are eternal. Yeah, there is eternal life, but you have to surrender to wisdom and love.
Yeah.
Instead, they're saying, no, I want my ego to survive, and I don't trust, and I'm inept in anything but being a bastard. So I had to make a machine to preserve this.
Yeah,
Wow.
the Greek word for repentance is metania, the change of what? Mind. And what it's really telling you is it's not just being apologetic for something bad that you've done, but it's a life process of ascesis. It's a life process of changing your mind to bring it in conformity with that logos, and that's a spiritual thing. It's not something that's mechanical or reducible to easy formulae, for the simple reason that everybody is different. And there is in Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a practice called the Jesus prayer, and the Jesus prayer is a very simple little prayer that goes, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy upon me, please note the word here, the sinner. Well, why are you referring to yourself as something so absolutely unique in all of human history? Well, it's because you are absolutely unique. So we have this mechanistic approach, and then we've got this approach that, as you say, just about every spiritual tradition on the planet indicates that you have to have some deep transformative change of mind. And mind, let us note here, isn't simply the process of the intellect. It's your emotions, it's your passions, it's your
intuition.
Yeah, exactly.
Creativity.
It's your everything. It's all involved in this process. And we've looked at, if you look at Western culture and the way it's evolved, is we've reduced even that to simplistic, revivalistic, evangelistic notions that you march up the altar at a crusade and it's going to fix everything. No, that's not the way it works, and it's not the way it's worked in any spiritual tradition on the planet that I can think of. So it's, I don't know. We're looking, I think, Al, at the problem, really, to draw upon the musical analogy again, we're looking at the problem of the contrapuntal culture versus a culture that lives on only one level, and the most simplistic and materialistic level at that. And it's breaking down, and because it's not a rational, natural order of things. That's why it's in the mess.
It's not a sustainable order of things.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'd say that these people are adhering to they are trapped in the dualistic, in the polarity field.
Absolutely, I agree.
Whereas, so what we need to do to be free is to transcend the polarity. So this transformation you're talking about, it has to contain our whole being, and the heart is closer to the three number thing than, because the intellect is a manifestation of the duality.
Right.
Because in order for me to think, I have to be able to distinct stuff. I have to dissect it. I have to analyze. That means to cut it up and say that this thing is different from this thing.
Yep.
And there I'm already trapped in the tension. Obviously, I can learn from within the system about the details and the nitty-grits of the system.
Right.
But when I enter the heart, I enter a combining, a unity aspect.
Right, a synthesizing aspect.
Synthesizing, thank you. And that's the open system, not the closed.
Precisely. And this is why I keep telling people, thinking analogically is crucial to understand what that really entails, because what it's really asking you to do is go deeper and to synthesize. To realize that you academically may specialize in, geopolitics or sociology or what have you, but to realize that even in those studies, you are inevitably going to have to understand history or science or law or literature or what have you, because that's all part of being human. These are all human products. And the synthetic approach is precisely, we started out with education. This is precisely what education is, particularly in this country, is trying to drum out of you. Yeah. You get your degree in this subject and you must confine yourself to that subject in that career and only that career. Well, nonsense. Which of us really has led the life that we thought that we were going to leave when we were doing all of that? Well,
exactly. It goes back to the educational thing, because this specialization, I know you have a word in academia when you have a multi-subject approach.
Interdisciplinary approach.
Yes, right. And that's deliberately starved.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because that leads to a bigger perspective. That leads to the understanding of being able to.
And it leads to the process of thought, where you're able to look at thought. To look at all contexts and be able to start to discern parallel structures, parallel forms, parallel ideas.
Which increases your language. Precise language, yes.
And I think that if you approach it in the right spirit, it has a very humbling effect on the heart, because you realize to a certain extent that you're not alone, number one. And it also allows you, somebody once told me, I think it was C.S. Lewis or somebody, I forget who it was, that said that true humility is seeing things exactly the way they really are, including yourself. Oh, yeah. And, that's a huge, deep statement to make.
Non nobis, yes.
No, not a novice. It's not a novice statement to make.
No, in Latin, non nobis.
Oh,
not me,
nobis.
Not me.
Yes, I see. Yes, exactly. So I think it has a good effect. It can have a good effect on the heart, because it also opens you up to the reality that no amount of formal education is going to make you an expert, that we're all children, just sort of learning.
Yeah, the more I know, the less.
The more I know, the less I know. Precisely, and
the heart is the connector that makes us look at ourselves as a unity.
Yes, absolutely.
And not as separate.
Absolutely. We've trained ourselves in our educational system, so to speak, to neglect wisdom, to neglect humility in that sense, and we're seeing the effects in our culture. Everybody's out for themselves. We've created a culture of narcissistic, consumerist psychopaths.
Poor Donald Trump. So it's not his fault. He's if he didn't exist, history would have to invent him, to paraphrase the Marxists.
That's right. That's right. Oh my, yeah. Well, that says a mouthful right there. I mean, there's a guy that made his money off of casinos, so
Yeah. That reminds me, I have to ask you about casinos, but I'll not do it today because we have to wrap this up, unfortunately. I'll just say one thing, though, that some people listening may say, oh yeah, so duality is bad. So Pythagorean said that number 2 was evil. So you say that it doesn't exist in nature. Well, what about, like night and day, the black and white people, right?
Well, sure, yeah.
No, but I'd say that, no, they were right, the ancients, because you have day and night, but you also have evening and morning.
Yep.
Every duality is actually 4, and 4 comes after 3. If you look at the yin-yang, you have 4 there too. You have the little in the big, and you have the other little in the big with reversed colors. Again, you have 4. Mm-hmm. So 2 doesn't exist in nature. It is an illusion. There are no duality. The polarity is an illusion. If you have 2, you always have 4 if you look for the shades.
Yeah.
And so 0, 1, 3, 4. And as we know, if we have 4, we have 10. Then we have all the numbers. That's a tetractys.
The tetractys. Yeah.
So anyway, we have to wrap this up. Now, I'll just ask you about your books. By the way, interesting that you have this synchronicity that right before we're taking on, because we've planned a long time ago to move on to, to vary with other topics with you. So we planned this philosophical discussion back in November. Mm-hmm. And now you say that you've had this discussion on your site recently.
Oh, many times. Oh, yeah, many times.
Many times. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, many times. I'd say the vid chats on the website in the members area going back at least a couple of years are talking a great deal about these types of topics. Artificial intelligence, the metaphor, good and evil, free choice, conscious intention in the material world. We have some pretty far-ranging philosophical discussions, and
they pick it up in your books, of course. Which books would you say that somehow go into depths about these concepts?
Actually, it begins. I first tossed out the topological metaphor in the third Giza Death Star book, Giza Death Star Destroyed.
That's right.
In the appendix to chapter 9. I briefly mentioned it in the previous Giza Death Star book. So I introduced the idea very, very early on.
In the ancient series.
Yeah. Then I pick it up again in the Philosopher's Stone, which is a crucial book for elaboration of the metaphor, and then pick it up again in a very deliberate fashion in Grid of the Gods. But it's present if you start looking for it. It's present in all of the books in some form or fashion.
But wouldn't you say that the Yahweh book also goes into depth about this?
Oh yeah, the Yahweh book does.
Yahweh, the two-faced God, it's called.
The two-faced God goes into it.
Both the books you've collaborated with, Dr. Scott.
DeHart, yes. Yeah.
DeHart.
He and I have talked about this for many, many years in one form or fashion. The transhumanism book goes into it.
If we get him on, I'll ask him about it too, because he too is educated.
Oh yes, very much so.
Same as you.
Let's see, what other books talk about it? I'm missing one. It's in Babylon's Banksters.
Secrets of the
Secrets.
Unified.
It is in a certain kind of weird way in Secrets of the Unified Field. Like I say, it's in all of them, but deliberately so in the books I've mentioned.
More overtly. Yeah.
It is certainly present in Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age.
Right. I just began on that, so
yeah, it's present there, and it's present in two ways there. It's present in the musical analysis I did. I had one guy write me that he did his degree in music theory, and he simply couldn't understand what I was getting at. Well, again, I can't help it because I'm not doing conventional music theory with this type of analysis. So.
No, but still, he had better ability to understand it than people who aren't musicians. Hey, dude, if you're listening, look up the books of Jocelyn Goodwin. Okay, that will help you. Very deeply go into this.
Yeah. But again, I stand by the analysis I did because. We have to remember that those musicians were in that very deeply steeped hermetic alchemical culture. This is the way they thought. And I think conventional musical theoretical analysis leaves these types of considerations out of the picture.
Many of them were actually alchemists and astrologers
Yeah.
and magicians and stuff like that.
Yeah, the metaphor, I tell people all the time, this is what I use very deliberately and intentionally to write my books and to structure them in a way that they can be read alone, but they can also be read as part of that big, huge, overarching series where you can see how the books plug into each other.
Yeah. Speaking of that, what about the new one? I'm not talking about the educational one. We covered that. But I know your publisher were very early on. So what's it called?
It is called, pardon me, it's called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery.
Wow.
Subtitle is 9/11, the Fascist International, and Hidden Systems of Finance. That book is like the Third Way. I had to write the Third Way before I wrote this book. So in other words, this book is not accidental in the series.
But it sounds to me that it's tying together several different venues.
Yeah, it does.
At least we will have the Nazi series and the economical series come together there.
Oh yeah, they're coming together.
Crescendo, literal crescendo.
It's a crescendo, and there's quite a few things. I've warned people that this may be my most mediocre book, but there's a few things in it that are still going to hit people right between the eyes, I think.
And you wrote it in, what, a month?
I wrote it in a month and a half, literally, because I found out from people on my website that get the publisher's catalog. I had asked him not to put the book up for sale until it was actually in his hands. So it didn't appear on Amazon, but it did appear in his catalog. So I start getting all these emails from people saying, "Oh, did you know your new book is in David's catalog?" I said, "What?"
Of course. We are keeping an eye out.
Yeah. So I said, "Well, did he say when the book would be out?" "Oh, yeah, it's supposed to be out in April."
And it wasn't written yet.
No, it wasn't. I hadn't even started writing. I was still reading and researching. I thought, oh my God.
Yeah.
So I had to literally just sort of, that's why I was delaying being back on with you.
Yeah, you were nowhere to be found. You weren't even online.
No, I was literally in my other office day and night trying to finish reading and writing this thing in a whirl. I got to tell you, it was a whirlwind of writing. It was so bad, Al. I haven't even cleaned my house yet from the disaster of having to write this book in a month and a half. I mean, I've got a mound of dirty clothes to wash. I've got,
it looks like Einstein's lab in there.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
The mad professor.
But I finally got it out to him a couple of weeks ago, and I've just decided, that's it for this year, folks. You've got 2 books coming out this year. I'm spending the rest of the year doing my website stuff and reading all the stuff I want to read for the books I've got planned, and maybe writing some more music. And
good for you.
Just kind of taking it easy for a change.
Yes. Give yourself that Sabbath.
Yeah, yes. that was just it was like, oh my God, why did he do this to me?
No, but it's a blessing in disguise, because
it is.
Yeah, because people may think, no, let's pressure him, squeeze him to produce more. But I venture that before any creation is incubation.
Oh yeah.
So you right. So you need to be able now to enjoy a little for your health,
this book has been an incubation period for a number of years, and but I didn't plan on writing it like that.
No, it's impressive.
Well, I hope so. I have to warn people, when you read this thing, please realize that Joseph was writing it half the time when he was falling asleep.
Again, a blessing in disguise, because then your higher self can express itself better. Your
maybe,
rational mind. Or it may be like you slackers who think that when they're high, they're making better music just because they distort their perception.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
Speaking of music, we have also to say as a final thought, actually, people probably knew it already, but I discovered recently when I was going to update your. We have a little bibliography for all our guests, so I was going to update it, and I discovered that, damn, you've written books about music too.
Well, I've written some music. I haven't written books about music. The only thing I've written.
Oh, is it notes? What is it? It is in book format. You can buy some music.
Oh yeah,
stuff.
you can buy I think three movements from three different concertos that I composed. I've got the actual musical performance up on YouTube. They're locked privately, but I think they're up in the members area of my website.
So these are compositions you've made?
Yeah.
And you've written about Bach too, I think? Or
I wrote about Johann Sebastian and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. I analyzed two different pieces of music in Thrice Great Hermetica just to try and show people how you can apply this idea of topological combinatorial derivatives.
Like Atlanta Fugiens.
Yeah.
That's actually, I have the recording. Mm-hmm. That's actually a play by Michael the Alchemist. He wanted to express it both alchemical and in music. So he composed something called Atlanta Fugiens. And that's actually, you can actually buy that. Now, the reason I want to plug these things here now with you today is that this topic is so small, you know. So I think that the niche audience that has managed to endure this debate, not just because it's deep, but also because of all over the place, more unstructured. You're the structure and I'm the wild card, right? So, I mean, they are so refined that I think their music taste will probably also be a little refined. Well, so they may be interested in listening to, knowing that you compose and listening to it.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I composed back in the 1990s. 7 concertos for string orchestra and harpsichord.
Wow. From
C minor, D major, E minor, F major, G minor, A major, B minor. And I've been trying to get the scores into this computer program and get them up and available. But I got to tell you that these notation software programs take so horribly long because you have to peck in each and every last little note.
It's that damn duality. That's the reason.
Yeah, it is, and it is, and it's.
They can't fathom great music like that.
No, and you have to tell the computer how to perform it, which in many cases the notation software hasn't caught up with what is actually done in music. So there's certain things that the software won't do that I would, open stopping on violins and so on and so forth. But
what's the point of feeding your computer with this?
Well, it's the only way I can hear it or make it available for people to hear. I don't have an orchestra or harpsichord at my disposal. But that's the only way I can do it, and it takes just an enormous. I can't even begin to tell you how long.
But if you, by some miracle, would get a proper instrument, would you then prefer to record it
obviously,
acoustically?
But the problem there is I'd have to have an orchestra. I write for a rather large harpsichord, 4 choirs at least, and those are hard to come by and very expensive. I obviously can't afford any, but sure, I would rather do that. But the other problem is I haven't played a keyboard in almost 20 years. I probably couldn't play chopsticks now. It's not that bad.
Really? But because the keys at the keyboard, the computer keyboard, simulate the piano keys. I know from the music software I played around.
Yeah, they are very, very similar, but I'd have to practice.
And you can get the virtual tangents, of course.
Well, the problem also with these notation software things, I play harpsichord and pipe organ, and they basically give you one setting for each instrument. And of course, that doesn't allow you to display the full range of what a harpsichord or a pipe organ are really capable of.
Yeah, one of our other favorite guests, we're going to have him on a lot. He's an organist. He told me that his ability to perceive codes and crack codes has probably to do with his training as an organist.
Yes, absolutely.
You immediately understand, of course.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. When you look at some of the scores of Johann Sebastian Bach, for example, the B minor Mass, for example, you find all sorts of codes right in the score that, if you really stop and look at them, are rather intriguing. The Et Incarnatus, for example, from the B minor Mass, is written in 3/2 time. Well, why 3/2? Well, the Trinity, the second person of the Trinity becoming incarnate, two natures of Christ, and on we go. He paints his texts in a very interesting way. When they're singing the part of the Creed, Ascendit in Cielo, the music actually goes up, it ascends. Sitting at the right hand of the Father, the music sits down. He paints his text. There's little touches that.
Wow.
And then,
So several ways to express these principles.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Several layers.
Layer upon layer upon layer. He was fond of writing his name into the music, because in German, of course, the note Ha for H is actually the note B natural, and then Bay is actually B. So you can actually spell out the name Bach in notes, and he does this all the time. So
this is precisely what Francis Bacon and a few others did with
exactly.
steganography. Only they did it geometrically. He does it. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, the parallels we're talking about, music versus geometry, etc.
Oh, yeah. You find the original backmasking master. This wasn't invented by rock music. They were doing it in the Baroque era all the time.
Yeah.
So it's intellectual fun. If you can train your mind to listen to these patterns, and that's...
No. Even a plant realizes this. Yeah. It's proven. You don't need a mind.
Yeah, I know. Even a plant, yes. But that's the problem.
They prefer this music.
I know, but that's the problem. Plants understand it better than most modern humans.
What does that say about us?
That's the problem here,
Right.
I know exactly what that organist is talking about, because my organ teacher back in high school had me doing the same thing. The first thing he would do is plop a score up on the stand and just have me start analyzing it before I even put the fingers to the keyboard. Is this a feminine fugue? Is it a masculine fugue? Know
the tool before you play with it.
Yeah, know the tune before you play with it. Be able to look at the score and hear it in your head. Johann Sebastian Bach said that people that compose at the keyboard are puddling. You should be able just to hear it off the score paper. So it's music is, I think, so important to any really humane education, and art as well, literature, poetry, and so on.
What was it Blake said? It was the remnants of paradise that the flood didn't wash away, something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
Exactly. And it's that ability to craft words, or to craft a painting or a sculpture, that shows your intelligence and your craft.
Keeps us alive.
Yeah, it's not paint by numbers,
No, not like the American educational system.
Precisely. You went there too.
Yeah, and with that snake biting its tail, I'll give this teaser before we close. I'll ask Joseph another question when we are done here, that I will release on the sponsor section. And it dovetails with what we talked about. It's about culture. Let's do that when we are finished here. So, I think this covers it.
All right. Well, thank you for having me back on.
So many thanks to you for giving us your time. Very enlightening.
Oh, more than welcome.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to our show today. In it, we referred to a pre-discussion that was recorded separately regarding education, which will be released as a separate program. As for our post-discussion, you'll find that at our website, and if you are a sponsor, you can access it anytime. If not, you will have to wait until it will be published together with other backstage stuff. To become a sponsor, all you have to do is donate $1 or more through our PayPal link. And you don't need to have a PayPal account yourself to use our donation link, and that will give you permanent access. We do appreciate regular donation, and we are dependent upon it, but it's not a requisite. If you think we are worthy of your support, spread our shows to your network and online, because the more listeners we get, the more viable our program is, and the more shows we can produce with increasing quality. Before leaving you tonight, I want to read an excerpt from the ancient words of wisdom referred to in the show that's called Cosmogenesis, which relates to today's talk. Cosmos has no beginning and no end. All that exists in space-time is a condition of eternity. But beyond this, the Almighty One, Arche, dwelled in sleep before awakening. The eternal parent was wrapped in the sleep of the cosmic night. Light there was not, for the flame of spirit was not yet rekindled. Time there was not, for change had not re-begun. Things there were not, for form had not represented itself. Action there was not, for there was no things to act. The pairs of opposites there were not, for there were no things to manifest polarity. The eternal parent, causeless, indivisible, changeless, infinite, rested in unconscious, dreamless sleep. Other than the eternal parent there was naught, either real or apparent. Before the beginning, from one single nothing, appeared the only all we may call nous, the only one, central fire and universal mind. The one mirrored itself, and thus self-recognition brought forth plurality. That's it for today. Sincere greetings from your host Al and the Borealis team. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?